Thank you, Marna, for taking it in a very positive way. Thank you. Luckily, we missed my birthday, so that's good. That's good. Well, a few announcements before we start. Our next panel coming up is going to be amazing. It's called, well, let me get to the right day. It's called The Difference History Makes, Veterans, Classrooms, Community Museums, and Virtually. But first, just a few announcements. A few of you have asked us about the shuttles. Now, we have UF Health shuttles that are running between here and Midtown restaurants. Now, the term Midtown, to me, when I heard it, I said, what is Midtown? I know what Uptown or Downtown, right? Midtown is just this area around here, really. Like, we could be in Midtown right now, right? There's a lot of really great restaurants and places to hang out. And so as the spirit moves, now I'm not encouraging you to play hooky or anything, but we do have a shuttle. Now, you can walk across the street, and the restaurants are probably like a 5 to 8 minute drive, or walk, I should say, walk. There's Chipotle and a bunch of others right across the street. Or you can take the shuttle. And again, it's a UF Health shuttle. We have a staff member waiting in the covered walkway who can walk you to where the shuttle is just kind of pulling in that library niche parking lot, if you will. And that will be running between now and then when this panel ends, the panel starts rather 11:45, and then we'll go for about an hour. The other announcement I want to make is I wanted to acknowledge a very important individual here. In oral history, we say everyone has a story to tell, right? And that is true. And we've heard in the first panel when Dr. Randy Gill-Sadler talked about being able to interview Dr. Nikki Giovanni, and when Dr. Justin Hosby talked about being able to interview the amazing Ray Allen Hinton. But everyone has a story to tell. And if you do oral history, you know that oftentimes when you start to interview someone, they'll say, oh, I don't have anything to tell you, right? And so sometimes that first challenge is getting the person to tell their story. But the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program would like to take a moment to acknowledge an individual with us who is Emmett Till's second cousin,
yes.
Thelma Edwards. Okay, and Thelma Edwards is, thank you. We are very fortunate and honored, Ms. Edwards, to have you with us this morning. We would like to acknowledge the significance and the memory of Emmett Till, what it did for the movement. A New York Times article of the history of the Emmett Till lynching was published this past February. The article also mentioned the sale of the last remaining house that was not burned down in Rosewood. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Sherry Dupree, who's on the panel, because she was the person who connected us to Ms. Edwards. Thank you, Sherry. Mrs. Edwards, would you like to share a few remarks with us?
I'm very happy. I'm very happy to be here, and I'd like for you to know that. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. I'd like for you to know that, to remind you that the Emmett Till case has been reopened. I was born in Mississippi, and I was sent to an aunt, Emmett Till's grandmother, in 1939 when I was 8 years old, in order to get a good education. I'm the only person alive now that was there when Emmett was born. I was in a little piano recital, and my aunt said, I'm going and call Cook County Hospital to see what Mamie had. And Mamie, my aunt, Emmett, we all grew up together, and I'm really happy to be here. Moses Wright, he was taken from my father's home, and I hope that someday Mrs. Dunham will confess and tell the truth, and that his name will be free.
Amen.
We're setting up a few technical issues here, and I just want to say briefly that Ms. Edwards. So you'll be glad to know that every summer we take students from the University of Florida to Glendora, Mississippi, where the Emmett Till Museum is now. And that museum was built brick by brick, literally, by the community. And there are members of the community who remember, who know about the story. And so we make sure here that our students never forget the story of Emmett Till. And thank you for reminding us how important it is. So now I want to turn over the microphone to the Associate Director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, Dr. Ryan Marini. But long before he was a doctor, he was another interviewer with the Oral History Program, and you heard the stories earlier told by Justin Hoseby, Justin Dunavant, Randy Gill-Sadler. Ryan also was part of a really amazing cohort that included Marna Weston, and so I'm just really just happy that Ryan has decided to kind of stick around with us after earning his PhD in anthropology, and he's going to chair this panel. I'll turn the mic over. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you. So the folks sitting next to me are a few people who did a lot to help this project become what it was, and what it is, and what it will hopefully continue to be. These are people who really understand the meaning of history, the impact that it can have, the difference that it can make. And in the case of Ms. Dupree in particular, she's conducted quite a few interviews for the collection, and sorry. And so in the interests of time, because we don't have a whole lot of it for this session, we have a number of very powerful stories here. We agreed that each of the panelists would introduce themselves. They can do it a little more interestingly than I would. But just to go down the line so you see who sits before you, we have John Nelson of the Jefferson County Veterans of Foreign Wars. We have Sherry Dupree, the director of the Rosewood Heritage Foundation, Incorporated. Gail Phillips, the Lincolnville Museum and Cultural Center in St. Augustine. Curtis Michelson of the Democracy Forum. And Vivian Filer of the Cotton Club Museum, Incorporated, and a community activist, as many of you know. So I will pass the microphone along to Mr. Nelson.
Good morning, and it's almost afternoon. How about that? It's great to be here. I am John Nelson. I am the founder of VFW Post 251 in Jefferson County, and I had to do that because there was a post there that didn't accept people that was looking like me. And therefore, we founded that, and very shortly, within about 6 months, we were able to recruit more than 126 veterans of all from World War II, career, and other areas, and we established that post. And that post has been an award-winning post, and even this year we're on track to be All-American, which is the highest honor you can. As a veteran, I can say one thing, that I learned two things, and that was either you die or you live. And the second thing that I learned is that you kill or be killed. And that's my introduction.
Good morning to everyone. I'm Sherry Sherrod Dupree. I'm local here in Gainesville, and I'm very honored to be a part of this. My interviews deal with spirituality. My area is African American religion, and the Pentecostal holiness sanctified type churches. So by covering those type churches, I come across so many people who have stories to tell. I don't have to go out to ask them. They call me because they're begging to have their stories remembered in history. This is a portion of hidden history that we are opening up for the public. And I just love the Oral History Project because they are able to do the interviews. We are able to go short notice to wherever we need to go and work with interviewing people. The last thing I'll say, I'm with the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, Transatlantic Slave Trade. So I get a chance to travel the world and do some interviews not only in this country but in other areas, especially in England. We have to remember, when we're doing history, we have to look at all cultures, because so much of that history is not in our hands, it's in other folks' hands. So we have to deal with them and work with them so we can share. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Regina Gail Phillips. I'm the director for the Lincolnville Museum and Cultural Center. I have a background in journalism, and I'm a retired chef, and I've done a lot of different things. I'm not a historian, but I found that I love history. I volunteered into this position. I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go along, but I am just happy to be here to share what I know about the history of St. Augustine and Lincolnville with you.
Hello, I'm Vivian Filer, and I am local as well, and I'm not a historian. I didn't volunteer. I was volunteered to be one, but I relish the opportunity because what I have learned has just been wonderful, and I'm always open to learn more. That's why events such as this are so great, because we learn what is not written. It's not in the history book. It is his story, not ours. So this is the way we have to do it, and I'm so proud to be a part of it.
Hi, Curtis Michelson, and was one of the co-founders of the Democracy Forum, which was one of the first community history projects to really delve deeply into the Ocoee Massacre, and I'll tell a little bit more about that in a minute. Today I serve on the Truth and Justice Project of Orange County, Florida, which is affiliated with the Equal Justice Initiative out of Montgomery, Alabama. And I guess this has become one of my life's work, and I'll share more of that with you in a little bit.
If we could give everyone a round of applause. And then I'll hand off to Mike.
Thank you. I am a history maker. I'm a former fire chief, former chief deputy state fire marshal, former politician as chairman of the Board of County Commissioners, so I've had a lot of history making. One of the first in the state of Florida in a lot of areas. But what today I want to share with you, veterans don't primarily look to make history. We're involved in war. We're involved in preparing and securing the freedoms and democracies that we have earned in this nation. And that's our job, to defend that. And so we put our lives on the line. When we wear the uniform, we put our lives on the line. And that's been happening for a number of years, ever since the foundation of this country, from the beginning in the 1700s all the way up until present time. I even have a daughter that's a first lieutenant, 22 years old, in Afghanistan, getting ready to go to Iraq. What I want to do today is just give you a short overview of history makers that's been in the military. First of all, go back to the Continental Army. There were blacks there. And basically you had blacks in the Army, blacks in the Navy, and you had them in militia and state militias. Now, in the northern area you did have blacks, but in the South they did not provide militias because the slave owners were afraid to arm them, knowing what might happen. Next slide. Something happened in St. Augustine in the late 1689. Black folk living in South Carolina began to learn that it was a very easy task to become free. If they were able to escape from South Carolina, which was under British rule then, to come to Florida, which was under Spanish rule, or Spain, all they had to do, two things. They would actually commit themselves to the Catholic religion and primarily give over to allegiance to the governor of Spain, and they became free people. So as early as 1738, you had free black people living in St. Augustine. One of those notable people was Francisco Menendez, a man that basically had exceptional military skills. He actually fought the British, who were trying to come in and take St. Augustine from Spain and prevail. They were never able to really overrun them. And of course, Fort Mose is out there today. Now, what happened, I saw this little thing on this wall over here. It says Cuba. What happened to Francisco Menendez after Spain said, well, we'll give it over to the British people? Those black folk went to Cuba. And that's why you have black folk in Cuba today. Next slide. And I think everybody knows about Christopher Attucks. He was a patriot. And of course, because of protests, he was one of the first African Americans killed, or one of the first Americans killed in the early 1770s. Next slide. Everybody knows Harriet Tubman. What did she do? Underground Railroad, right? Now, there's another part of Harriet Tubman that you may or may not know unless you've done some research. She was a soldier in the Union Army. She was a cook, she was a spy, she was a nurse, and she was the first woman. Now, everybody get excited about a woman leading an expedition in the military. Harriet Tubman did that early on. Yes, General Hunter gave her the authority to select Colonel Montgomery to go on a raid in South Carolina. They got all of the rice and everything up there. And what happened from that? They were able to get 750 slaves who, a lot of those, joined the Union Army. Next slide. So that's a little bit about Harriet Tubman. Everybody knows about the Buffalo Soldiers. They were given that name because the Indians saw their superiority in fighting. And so because of their skill set, they became the Buffalo Soldiers. Next guy. World War I, there were a lot of heroes, but there was one black man, Henry Black Death Johnson. And why he received that name was because in World War I, you know, they were segregated. Black folk couldn't fight along with white folk. So what did they do? They sent a group of people to France to help France conquer the Germans. Henry Black Death Johnson single-handedly wiped out almost a whole company of German soldiers by himself, and that's why he was given the name Black Death. And of course, they was on loan to them. And of course, Benjamin O. Davis was an officer that came up through the ranks, and later on you'll find out he went on next slide. And one war he came to brigadier, but then his son in World War II, while he was a brigadier, his son went all the way before he retired to a 3-star. And I think President Obama, during his tenure as president, went ahead and conveyed the 4-star to him. And of course, the people were always questioning whether or not black folk had the skill set or the knowledge to do other things than just be mess people or people cooking. We call it mess, that's called the food police. But anyway, you had what we call the Tuskegee experience. They were bombardiers, they were navigators, pilots, support people and all of that. It took that kind of team to keep the airplanes flying in the air. And of course, a movie was made about them, the Red Tails. And a lot of those people flying B-29s and others made certain that they requested the Red Tails, because with the Red Tails, they were not going to get shot down. Next slide. World War II, Dory Miller, he was a guy who was a messman, a cook. But when it came to the Japanese, when they first came into Pearl Harbor, Dory Miller had no training on an anti-aircraft gun. But by watching others, he learned how to fire that thing. And what he did, he went out there during the time that Zeros were coming in. That was the planes Japanese flew. And what he shot down a number of those. And plus, he took care of a lot of the wounded soldiers, sailors on the ship and everything. And of course, the other group of people that were the last group of folk who integrated the Department of Defense, which was the Marine Corps, was the Mumford Point Marines, and that's because President Roosevelt signed an executive order to say you will not be a segregated unit any longer. Of course, that was across the board with all kind of things. And of course, the Mumford Point Marines made history in Saipan and other areas. And of course, 761st Tank Battalion, again, somebody said that I don't think black folk can actually steer tanks or armor vehicles. General Patton found out early when he went up against Rommel in Germany, first of all in Africa and then Germany, that he needed some folk who were fearless, because those tin pans that they were steering was no match for the Panzers. They called on the 761st Tank Battalion in France, and they annihilated Rommel. And of course, there was a second lieutenant that came through the ranks in the early 40s and got out, then came back in once President Truman integrated the Department of Defense. And so that was General Julius W., well, actually at that time, Second Lieutenant Julius W. Becton. And of course, Becton, of course, went on to be so many different things. Probably is unlike most of us. He had so many experiences. 40 plus years in the military, then went on to become the third director of FEMA, and later on the superintendent of DC Public Schools. So here is a man who is still living today at 94 years old. Next slide. So I can tell you that I have had the opportunity, I'm 71 years old now, but I had the opportunity to work with a lot of these World War II vets, the Korean War vets, and what you've seen on the screen up there is a fellow that I grew up in his dad's project, was the Sneed quarters. Ernest Sneed, who was in 1942, became one of the first Mumford Point Marines from Jefferson County. And Mr. Sneed just demised a couple of years ago at the age of 98. Was not able to go to the Capitol to receive the Congressional Gold Medal from President Obama, but he had General Lawrence Snowden, who lived in Tallahassee, a good friend of mine, to come and award that to him in Monticello. And of course, Lieutenant Barnhart primarily was one of the first graduates of Florida A&M University, ROTC school. And of course, all of these that you've seen up there, they have been interviewed by the Samuel Proctor Orey Institute. One of the things in work with Dr. Ortiz, we were able to get that done, and I believe we got them all of the World War II and all of the Korean War veterans. So, and of course you have the Dennis Gallen, 94 years old, still living, driving, and walking every day. And the last person up there is an amazing guy. That is Reverend John W. Isom Sr. 11 kids, 7 of those kids have combined 130 years of military service, with the highest rank being a captain. So it's an amazing group of people that I've had the chance to work with, still working with them. And if it's God's willing, we'll tough it out together. Thank you.
Wow, this is hard to follow you. I've done a few of the Memphis men over in Jacksonville, but nothing like what he is talking about here. I'm going to start with 1619. What is significant about that year? Anybody? That's right, 400 years. And the ceremony is going to be in August. Every one of us need to be there. That is the 400 years. And we've been working toward that now, some of them for 4 and 5 years, trying to make sure that this is done and we are well represented. You know, we came here mainly as servants, but we were here. And we have been here ever since. So that is my beginning and talking with you today. But the second thing, I'm going to skip about a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book that I have here. And this lady's name is Susie King Taylor. Anybody ever heard of this woman? I know 1 or 2 hands have gone up here. Susie King Taylor? No? All right. This is something that we need to introduce to our students and to our people. I was in Savannah last week, and that's where she's from. She was from Savannah, Georgia, from the Savannah, Georgia area. This is her diary. And these are the kinds of things that we need to introduce our people to. Yes, she was with the military, so we tie right back in. She was a nurse. She also was religious bound. She also worked with the Underground Railroad. This woman did a lot. These are the kind of people that we need to tap into because it is our hidden history. So I'm going to just put this there. She was a nurse and really spent many years, and the stories are so good because she talks about how she ministered to those men, not just health-wise, but mentally. And that's how we differ our history from some other history, because basically I deal with the spirit, the religious aspect of learning. And that is different from what you will get otherwise in dealing with some of our materials. Now, I'm going to go over to St. Augustine just for a minute. There was a name that I have not heard, Guy Johnson. Have you ever heard of Guy Johnson out of St. Augustine? Guy Johnson, I picked his name up through Zora Neale Hurston and her research. And Guy had a big restaurant over there. He catered mainly to the Caucasian people, not too much to us, but we worked in the restaurants that he had. And he had about housing areas for about 80 families. African-American man. But the key thing that you would remember him for, he was the man that would go out on the boats at night and bring the ships in before the lighthouses were done and things were set up for people. So Guy Johnson is a name, and I was over in St. Augustine. The only thing I could find was on A1A Highway, a street named for him. And the reason that came up with me is because the family came to me and asked me to do in-depth research. That's what I do. The same thing was with Rosewood. That's how I got involved with Rosewood. I didn't know a thing about Rosewood until the family came to me and asked me would I help them. I did the insurance records and other records that other folks wouldn't touch to find history, to verify that these people existed. The same thing with the Guy Johnson family, because they came to me on and wanted to know more, and we proceeded. So the next thing that I will share with you is dealing with the Gullah Geechee people, and most of us are familiar with them. And we've done several trips there taking students, because we have to educate our students. We have to do this from the classroom. We have to do it from the community. We have to put it in the museum so that they can see it. And we have to put it in all virtual ways so that they can know that this is history. And we've got several people in here who have been on the Gullah trails with us. But this last time when we went to the slave quarters. When you go on these summer trips and so forth, they ignore the slave quarters. They will not take you there. They'll take you to the lighthouse. They'll take you to eat, and they'll take you to other places. This is travel all over the world. Asked to go to the slave areas, and we went this last time. It was terrible. And the bus had to have 2 men sitting in the front, and they had to get off the bus and move the bushes. And it was real bumpy, and it was twisted and turning. And we got a man that's sitting right back there smiling. He was on the bus with us. It was awful, wasn't it? But we got there, and we got a chance to see the true slave quarters as they were in their state. They told us, now, you got to be careful because it hadn't been cleaned up out here. You can see a little bit of anything or everything. Be careful. But do that on all of these tours that you're taking all over the world and so forth. I do that because it's important that we know. And they won't share it with you. On these cruises, the same thing. You get on these cruises and you stop in various locations, the Dutch areas and so forth. You don't see anything related to your culture. You see what they want you to see. So know that there is a culture there, and it needs to be explored. And if you ask for it, they will share it with you and make provisions for you to go to those areas and see what is available. Sometimes the timing is short, but at least you can say you went in the doorway and you know a little bit about who they were and maybe a couple of names of the people who were there, and then you can do the research when you get back home. But another thing that I must bring up, dealing with education, and this is what this is all about. And Lincoln School especially, you mentioned that Lincoln School closed in the middle of the year. Is that correct? And you all had to go to the white school. I wasn't in Florida at that time, but in 1970 was when the law passed that schools had to be integrated, and we are right on that. I want to read you just one little section because my research is different than most. I do FBI files. I'm certified to pick up religious FBI files. I get them all the time. I pick up obituaries and things that most people say are no value. And they aren't any value when you go to the appraisal. You know, if I carry 500 obituaries in from Chicago, which I have, and ask them to put a value on it, oh, it has no value. These folks were out of Mississippi and Alabama and so forth. They didn't do anything in Chicago but live. Oh, yeah, we got to change the value. We got to put a value on ourselves, and we have to realize that we are important people. And then these folks that are doing the appraisals, we got to get some of them there that are African Americans. We don't have many appraisals. You can't find one, and if you do find one, they're scared to death to put the material down in formats because they say, well, you know, if we put this down, this is of no value. This is of no value. Give your material value, okay? But now let me go back. In 1970, I have to read this, Beatrice Alexander. Have you ever heard that name before? Okay, it's mentioned in this book right here, We Can Do It. That's what I was trying to get done before we got in here. He's talking about the integration of the schools. A dedicated St. Paul Church of God in Christ member, Beatrice Alexander, born in 1906, died in August of 1981, and others sued the Holmes County Board of Education in Mississippi for failing to desegregate public schools in 1969. Alexander versus Holmes Board of Education, and it gives all the laws, and I'm going to skip that. In the United States Supreme Court ordered immediate desegregation of public schools in the American South, because that's where the problem was. It followed 15 years delay in integration by most Southern school boards, and that's your key, it's your school boards, because they determine what goes on in your districts. After the court ruling on Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. That stated that the public schools were unconstitutional. This Unitarian school law went into effect in 1970. Now, the reason that law went into effect right away, the government was cutting the money. That's the issue. And when we deal with the issues, we don't deal with the issues. They say, oh, well, y'all, you know, we got to switch now, and y'all got to go to the other school. When they cut your money off, this is a new ball game. And that's what happened here. And this is why we need to give kudos to Beatrice Alexander. Now, you don't know anything about the struggles that the Church of God in Christ had to go through to get this done. The many days that they didn't go to school, they didn't have materials, they walked in the rain. All of those details is the kind of history that we are not covering. This is hidden history based on what we know. I went through this book just briefly, and I thank him for putting it out. He's got 3 or 4 pages in here dealing with this situation, but nothing dealing with what these people had gone through with secondhand books, no school to go with, the ceilings leaking, and all the other problems that they had to deal with before the schools were done. That's why they did it. Now we know all the issues that happened afterwards. So I'm saying to you, when we look at our history, look at our history from the point of who we are, who wrote this history, and why we are not covering the spiritual portion of our history. Not only not covering the spiritual portion, we're not covering the feelings, the actions, the stresses that we have had to go through in order to get this history through. And then when it's through, you know, oh, it just happened. Oh, no, it didn't just happen. The struggles that people have gone through have hurt so many, and so many have lost their lives. Another thing that I'm very strong in is lynchings. And the lynchings are very strong with me because so many of these people that have been lynched were out of the church. You don't want to hear that, but it's the truth. And a lot of them were African-American men. And if you ask black people in general, everybody's going to tell you that they belong to a church. Okay? And most of them are going to tell you I'm a Baptist, a Methodist, or whatever. That's fine. And we are spiritual people. So by churching and by taking information from this perspective of looking at it from religion, I am able to do many more things than what most people can do with history. My fun thing is the FBI files. If you want to know about black folks, it's in the FBI files because, oh yes it is. and especially our pastors. Yes, because they're influencing and making changes in your community. And anytime you have a right to make changes, then you can make changes and determine what the people do. They've even come out with sermons that were given to black pastors that they had to give on Sunday morning, saying that y'all ought to be happy that you're here in America and you're not in Africa anymore. Now you know, and who wrote those sermons and gave it to them and then forced them to give those sermons on Sunday morning to their congregations? This is where we need to go and look closer at who we are, where we're coming from, and what we have to do right now is voter registration. Don't back off on this. Let's deal with voter registration, deal with our youth, and then we're going to have to deal with our prison system. We were in the prisons 2 weeks ago. I go into prisons quite often, and we have to be able to talk in a way that we can let them know that it's going to get better. And we always have to be positive. Positive when it's killing us. Smile when it's hurting us. And when we are able to put that Bible and put God's word in front of us, we're going to make some progress. Thank you.
I want to start by saying we don't make history. History makes us. These are not my words. They're the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. History is a way to explain the relevance of the past and its connection to the future. It allows us to show how those who went before us helped to shape the world we occupy. As a museum director, my job is to present the stories in ways and in the context that will make them both intriguing and authentic. We must show why the stories of pioneer, residents, and civil rights workers matter in the ongoing quest for freedom and emancipation. I didn't start out to be a preserver or presenter of history or to operate a museum. But the first day I walked into the Lincolnville Museum, I saw a dream deferred, was festering and in need of nourishment. And just as quickly as I could think it, I said, I need to find a way to help. So like the prophet Isaiah, I was compelled to act. I got involved as a volunteer, a board member, a grant writer, and now as executive director. I had to call on all my skills as a former journalist, business owner, home decorator, and world traveler to gain insight into the people whose stories were on display at the Lincolnville Museum and Cultural Center. I got to know the pioneers, the marchers, the overcomers, all through digging into their stories. Oral histories, they were not a part of what was available at that time. I had never even heard of the Samuel H. Proctor Oral History Program. Most of what I knew about St. Augustine was on the Fountain of Youth. I knew a little about civil rights and a lot about Butler Beach, where I played as a kid. I learned about the Spanish relationship with Africans in America and Fort Mose. Juan Guaido, who was there before Ponce de Leon, and who also came back with Ponce de Leon when he discovered the Fountain of Youth in St. Augustine. See, there's history that goes back beyond 400 years, and that's a project that I am working with people and scholars. If you know people who are working on that, we're here, and I think that we need to have more advocacy for that because our history in America did not begin with chattel slavery. I learned about Antonio Proctor. Now, Antonio Proctor played a role in interpreting for the British during the Seminole Wars, and he was rewarded a gift of land, and his history continues to this day. If any of you have been to Tallahassee to the Knott House, you know that that goes back to the roots of Antonio Proctor. Absolutely. I learned about the Seminoles and their conquest and the impact that that made on the development of downtown St. Augustine. So I'd say that in reverse because the impact they made was because they forced white people to move from the outskirts of St. Augustine and other areas into the cities. So that's how you got your houses, your guest houses and things in downtown that are now museums in downtown St. Augustine. I learned that not only was Chief Osceola one of the people who was arrested as a young warrior, but there was another young man named John Horse who would go on and they would become a part of the Trail of Tears. I learned that St. Augustine was among those places where the Emancipation Proclamation was read early and inspired black men thirsty for freedom to join the ranks of the South Carolina volunteers and go off to war with no promise of pay. I learned that a slave-holding lawyer, landowner, and diplomat would befriend an old man who was snatched from his homeland as a child, sold into slavery, and will become an ordained Methodist minister. That friendship will cause the slaveholder to inspire philanthropists to join him in his bequest to support a post-Civil War black community in St. Augustine to this present day. I learned about how the 3 nuns who taught young black students were arrested under new Jim Crow laws, which they fought, and they were ruled unconstitutional. I learned the role that St. Augustine played in the national civil rights movement and how photos of muriatic acid being poured at children swimming in a whites-only pool, that it would move a president to demand the passage of the Civil Rights Bill to avert additional international disgrace. We have the story of Jimmy Jackson, who survived the KKK lynch mob and who has also embraced the Black Lives Matter movement because he knows, as we know, that the struggle continues. We don't make history, history makes us. The words of Dr. King is still true today and forever. Our job is to make sure we don't pervert it or obstruct it from the light of day so that we will not be subject to repeat the history that would stop Reconstruction by allowing the passage of Jim Crow laws to stop the progress of newly emancipated people. Today, we cannot allow voter registration or voter restriction and suppression to roll back the gains of the Voting Rights Act. Today, we use oral histories, historic reenactments, art, literature, and live performances like the Langston Hughes Project, which we did just last week, to show the history of African American people in the struggle for equality in America. A picture is worth 1,000 words is still true and can often convey a message it would take us hours to convey with only words. The spoken word combined with images is even stronger and intensifies the impact of a story. A segregated Jim Crow South has given way to a once again emboldened separatist movement that has permeated the highest ranks of our U.S. government and its institutions. The new Jim Crow draws a connection between criminalizing black youth and using them for free labor in the penal system. Free labor was the linchpin of slavery and is the linchpin of the new Jim Crow. Attitudes of today are not that different from those of the 60s as it relates to white supremacy and the racist vitriol they spewed. Black lives, brown lives, and everyone with a little melanin in their skin is under attack just because a segment of our society feels threatened by the supremacy or the surgency of people of color wanting to take the reins of their own destiny. History shows we're fighting an age-old battle we thought was won a long time ago. Revisiting history through museums, cultural programs, the arts, and education helps to remind us of the past and to inform the next generation of what was. History can show how one person can make a difference and have an impact on legislation, moral trends, and society at large. We don't make history, history makes us.
Well, I'm not going to disagree with Dr. King, but I will kind of amplify what I think he was saying. History makes us, but we also help rewrite and recreate and enlarge the meaning of our history. And that's what all of us are doing. We shed new light on it. And so the part I want to speak to is doing community history work. Our panel is called The Difference History Makes: Veterans, Classrooms, Community, Museums, and Virtually. I'll speak to some of the community side. And I met Dr. Chalmers. Where are you, Dr. Chalmers? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so it was an honor to meet Dr. Chalmers. And he said, tell a story. So I'll try to start with a story, because the first question Ryan wanted us to speak to is how we got into the work. So how did I get into the work? Well, to all apologies to history, how many history teachers in the room? Apologies to history teachers. It was not the history teachers that got me interested in this or sparked me. Mrs. Banks in 11th grade put me to sleep. Sorry, guys. It was the textbook, not the teacher. I had this sense, I think like a lot of us, that something was missing in the textbook. Even as a white kid, something's wrong with the story. And I moved to Nicaragua after I graduated from college, and I started to get a sense of, yes, we were not told the whole story. So there's been a kind of thread for me for quite a while. But the story I want to tell you is where my interest in the particular work that I started with Democracy Forum got lit. I had a very good friend named Otis McCaster. Otis passed away about 3 months ago. And Otis and I hung out a lot. This is the early 1990s. I was living in downtown Orlando, struggling, doing various things, and Otis was a great guy to hang with. He loved marching bands. He went to Southern College, and we would watch FAMU, not for the game, we watched for the marching bands, you know, that kind of relation, right? Watch the Rattlers do the Death March. And as a drummer, we had Otis, you know, we had a lot to talk about. We listened to funk. He introduced me to great funk music. I was basically a kind of white liberal kid, downtown Orlando, trying to figure my life out. And Otis had a beautiful voice, the most resonant, rich, deep voice. And I would always say, Otis, man, you need to be on the radio. It's so good, your voice. He said, yeah, no, Kurt, I've always wanted to. I've never had a way to break in. At the time, I was doing some activism in Orlando, and I knew a guy on the air named Clive Thomas. He was one of the few, maybe only liberal voices on AM radio at the time. Clive had a show out in a little city called Ocoee, a suburb of Orlando. And at the time, I didn't know anything about the history of Ocoee. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Ocoee massacre. Thank you. And I said, Otis, my friend Clive, he'll get you on it. And it's a graveyard shift, but if you go out there, he'll take you. Otis only went once, and he never went back. This is like 1995, and frankly, I was a little pissed. You know, help a brother out, you know, good white liberal. And what does he do? He only goes one time, and he never went back. Fast forward a couple years later, I'm in a church dialogue around racism and anti-racism, and African-American person of color comes into the conversation, and she grew up in Central Florida, and she said something in passing about the Ocoee massacre. And I said, what? What was that? Say it again. And she starts to unfurl the story of growing up. She grew up in Apopka, and they would never drive through Ocoee at night, and Apopka is a neighboring city, because you just knew even in the 1970s and 80s, this was a horrible place that had such a scorched memory of burning out an entire African-American community, right? And an unknown number of dead. And so it just was this wake-up call, and all of a sudden it took me back to what I'd thought about with Otis, like, well, of course not. And then it prompted me to ask him, why didn't you go back? He said, Kurt, they tailed me. The cop watched me all night. He was watching me. And I was so nervous. And I said, damn, I'm so sorry. And he and I, you know, it was a whole new kind of friendship after that and a whole new dialogue. And what prompts me as a white person, as a white man to do this work, is to use the old preacher's phrase, comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. You know, when I speak to primarily white audiences, I talk about the power of this work is we need to really look at things like the Ocoee Massacre, and there's one in every one of your towns, wherever you're from. If you're from the South, or I don't care if you're from Duluth, Minnesota, there's a powerful project of reconciliation and honesty and fessing up in Duluth, and it happened in our town. And it's happening in a bigger way. So to go with the last question that Ryan asked, you know, what difference does it make? The difference is that we get to recreate, tell a larger story. We get to do this work together. I was inspired by Sherry Dupree. She started the Rosewood Forum, and we asked her to come to Orlando. We said, how do we do this work? And you meet great people like Sherry doing this work. And you build new bridges of understanding, and you get past the simple white liberal do-good, and you get down and get real. And we don't always agree with each other. Sometimes it's messy, and it's difficult, and it's painful, but it's really worth it. And I'm just really excited to say that when we were doing this in the 90s, it was pretty uphill, and it's still difficult. But with what EJI, if y'all haven't seen it, the Equal Justice Initiative out of Montgomery, check it out, Google it. They've really put some wings under all of our sails. So they've helped launch hundreds of new projects around the South. I'm proud to say that In 1997, when we started Democracy Forum, our Orange County Regional History Center basically dissed us and said, we don't want anything to do with this work. Now, we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of Ocoee. In 2020, they're all over it. We have a brand new curator of that museum named Pam Schwartz, and she said, Curtis, we're solving the Rome problem. So what's that, Pam? She said, the rich old white men problem. She's, right? The ones who've been running these museums and making the decisions, we're changing that. This is a young white woman. This is a different generation, right? And so Equal Justice Initiative has really sparked a lot more in the work, and I encourage you to check that out. There is a lot of places you can plug into it. The difference it's made is the relationships you're going to build and the honesty and the larger definition of history. And maybe if we can start impacting those textbooks, kids are going to wake up in history class. They're going to pay attention. My son back, are you paying attention, Aiden? He didn't want to come today because it's spring break. Thank you, Aiden, for coming. And, you know, that makes history. Your eyes pop open when we start talking about this stuff this kind of way. So I'll end with that.
I'm not too sure which place I fit here, but I want to talk about Gainesville, Florida, the community of Gainesville, because I know that a lot of these young people at this table are talking about what they read, but I lived it. I'm 81 years old, so I was in the segregated school, and I know about Lincoln High School, and I know about the books with no backs, and I know about the fact that when integration really started, Tiny Talbot was not a good man. He was not loved by us, and he didn't treat us right. So whatever you hear anybody else say, I always tell people, if you want to know about black people, you got to read books black people write. I'm just saying. But here's what I want to tell you. The way I got involved in history was because when I graduated from school, my friends graduated, went to college, came back as teachers. By then, the schools had closed. They'd moved all the black kids to the white school, closed all the black schools, left all the black books in the black school in terms of prose and poetry. And so my friend said, would you come to class? Because I started doing story time when I was in high school. Would you come and tell the stories? Well, I did, because I only do black stuff. You see how black I am? I only do black stuff. So I went in, I started in with the black writers. And I could talk about James Weldon Johnson, Paul Laurence Dunbar, Conte Cullen, and their work, but leading up to the piece, I could talk about black history around that piece, where they were born, who they were, what impact they made, why they wrote this, what impact did that have on us in terms of the writings through these very famous women. That's been over 60 years. I am now involved in a project that is restoring, or has restored, an old building that was named the Cotton Club Museum and Cultural Center. So now I am the CEO of a museum. I know nothing about, I have to learn about museums because we've been into restoring. But I do want history preserved. Why? Because as a black faculty at Santa Fe College, which I love, I realized, being the black person in the room, that there was so much that people didn't know. I mean, white folks teaching black students and not knowing their culture is bad news until we teach them. I often had to go to the defense of my students, which I willingly did, because it wasn't so much their knowledge, but it was a lack of cultural norm with the faculty. One of the faculty members said after faculty meeting that, you know, Vivian can really tell you off. It takes 15 minutes to realize she did. But that was part of what I had to do. Because, you know, if you don't stir the water, I believe in stirring the water. Yeah. And so I want the stories that I tell you to stir the water. Back in 1956, I'm the last class, my class, out of the Lincoln Building on 10th Street. 10th Street, yes. We were in 1956. 1957, they graduated. Well, when they built Lincoln High School on Waldo Road, Gainesville High School on 13th Street, they went all out with Gainesville High School because it was going to have all the white kids in it. It was just gorgeous with air conditioning. They built Lincoln High School, is that right, Albert? No AC. No AC. And the reason I know how bad it was I was an older lady going to college because there was no college for me to go to until 1968 when Santa Fe opened. And we had classes in there. And you know the DNA squirrel thing that goes around? I'm sitting in there in the hot sun. I could just see that thing moving all over the room. It was so hot in there. See what our children were going through to go to school? So I am involved in history because I know that if we don't find it and teach it the way it really happens, we're always going to go. And here's my other challenge. I always tell folk that black folks have got to stop taking all the responsibility of the history. White folks were there too. You know that? I asked them, listen to my TED Talk. It's Lessons from My Sidewalk, Vivian Filer. I said to some of my faculty one day, we're having this workshop, and they were saying, well, Vivian, when I was there, I didn't have black, you know how they do that to you. I didn't have black folks in my neighborhood. I didn't have black folks in my school. I finally said, well, didn't you wonder where we were? I mean, how long can you go on saying that? Because you can't. I only do things that I'm comfortable with in terms of trying to tell of the history. Well, I was here and a civil rights worker and a marcher. Also, the women's rights movement started 50 years ago. They're celebrating, and I was a part of that. I remember the meetings. I remember the women, Gainesville Women for Equal Rights, the first integrated group of women in Gainesville. I was a member of that. I chaired the healthcare committee. Our job was to get the doctor's office, dentist's office, and the hospital integrated. And here we go back to the laws again and the money thing. When we went to see the administrator and told him we were seeking integration because they received Hill-Burton funds, which were federal government dollars, and they couldn't discriminate because of that. Well, he didn't really like that. He really turned some shades of red that I can't describe. So we left, and they really didn't change it that day, but the civil rights group that was working with lawyers and all were able to bring it about. But I want to make you uncomfortable. I want you to be so uncomfortable that you get down to the root of the matter. We have got to stop making this pretty. It just isn't. I told my friends, they had a meeting at the Cotton Club Museum, and I said, I want to know what the people my age were thinking when they were sitting on University Avenue in Buholtz High School or GHS. And I was walking past there in the rain to go all the way across town to Lincoln. I want to know what you thought about me being out there. I'm not blaming you for it, but we got to lay all of it on the table and find a starting point. Because it's so bad now. We thought we had washed it over. No, it was just festering. And it's all alive and well. You know why? Because we didn't get to the bottom of it to begin with. And that's where I'm from. I don't mind telling you. I don't mind listening. But I really want you to tell me the truth because you can bet on it. That's what I'm intending to tell you. So we got that done. So what are we doing at the museum? We are trying to envelop history. I belong to the same organization as Lincolnville Museum does, and we're going to learn from all of them. But right now, we are just featuring local. We want to tell local history. We want to know who the piano players were for all the churches in my area, because they played on the second and fourth Sunday one place and first and third somewhere else. That's important. It's just as important as being the commissioner, because they were the fabric of society. We're going to archive those folks. And when our children grow up, they're going to have respect for that. They're going to feel worthy of that because it is a respectable thing to do. So that's where we want to go there. I also know that we always celebrate Juneteenth because we know Galveston, Texas finally let enslaved people know that they were free. Well, Florida didn't do it until May 20th, 2 years later, let people know. So we could celebrate all those kinds of things, and that's important to us. So we are proud to do those things. And as I said to you, I feel the urgency of doing that. And also, during my story time, was able to really reach kids, and I still do today. And if you really want to know what black sermons sounded like when they were written by us, you have to go to James Weldon Johnson's book, God's Trombone. And he captured those sermons there, and that's the way we did them there. So I'm proud to have been asked to be here today. I took over the responsibility of restoring this building, turned it into a museum. I'm a professor of nursing. I knew nothing about it. Thank you very much.
So at this point, if anyone has any questions, we do have a few minutes for that, and then we'll break after. Yes.
My name is Attorney John Dew,
Yes, sir. Yes, you are.
and there is Attorney John Dew. Loud enough. John Nelson, how you doing? My question to you, as you know, Paul has written a new book, right? Called Exceptionalism. But what exceptionalism means to me is to push out and put down. Let's talk about 1619. What happened in 1619? To bring to America, so Europeans, to make America a city on a hill, right? But to push out the Native Americans, right? That's what this city on a hill means, and also to bring their indentured servants, which was the beginning of slavery. All right? That's the way America was organized psychologically and culturally, even today. So I just want to share with Dr. Rivers, for example, who's from Florida A&M, because there was a special purpose of Florida A&M after the Civil War. And that purpose was supposed to be carried out by Jonathan C. Gibbs, okay, who was a minister in the Presbyterian Church, because he thought the AMEs had sold out in relation to slavery. You know, we sang Amazing Grace every Sunday, don't we? By a slave trader. So my question to all of you that's on this panel, we need to understand that the issue is not about civil rights, because Patricia and I carried on civil rights. We left North Florida and came to Miami-Dade, and they were glad to see me when they put me in the Community Relations Board and Office of Black Affairs and everything. But it was all a game.
Thank you.
It was all a game. We had a black superintendent, a black union, but they weren't interested in about educating the black poor children.
That's the problem right there.
That's right. Yeah, Patricia and I did all this work to get these colored folks into power. And you know the rest of the story.
I'll respond to Attorney Dew. Thank you, Attorney Dew. Attorney Dew and I go way back. I used to slip from my mother's house to go up to Memorial Missionary Baptist Church when Attorney Dew, Spivey Gordon, and Kent Spriggs were the attorneys moving in the 1960s of the civil rights over in Jefferson County, which was a real segregated county. And I would slip from my house, my mother's house, because if she knew that I was up sitting in the back listening to Attorney John Dew and all of those others, she would put one whooping on me. But I learned from that, and so Attorney Dew, and we've had the chance to work together, and I'm not going to be very long, but he spoke of Dade County, and when Hurricane Andrew came through, I was the chief adjuster for the state of Florida, and as I say, I've had multiple experiences as a first. And I had to go down there, and Attorney Do, you know that those divorced women were coming in with policies that had the husband and the wife name on it. And here I was, I said, well, we're going to cut that check, because all the small companies had already gone under. So I had $7 million, and he was the attorney, and I was the adjuster in there sitting, handling those folk. And those ladies said, I want that check paid to me. I said, well, we can't pay it to you. We can pay it to both you and the husband, because you never got the dissolution of marriage corrected where you can get it in your name. And so that's a problem that we even have today. So I can say that, Attorney Do, you and I have talked about some of the things, even in Jefferson County, just how bad it was, and it's still bad. It's going to, C.P. Miller and I right now, we are looking at ways that we can take our young minds to try to come together to make change. Now, see, they got rid of me as the chairman of the board because I did too much. But see, when you have the gavel of power, that's when you act. And I did that the 4 years that I was the chair on the Board of County Commissioners. When I became the chair, we paved all those dirt roads and all of those things. That 4.6 million, went back and got another 5 point. See, they don't want someone who is proactive. They want somebody to be reactive. So to answer your question is that we have to try to get all of the younger people. Dr. King utilized that process. He used young people. And we have to try to change their mindset. And they'll call us, well, you old folk, you old fogies. But yeah, we're going off the scene, but we have to try to get them to rally with us so we can actually team together to make the necessary change that we can make in our communities. That's my take on it just today. My wife gets at me. She said, even coming down here, you're going somewhere and you're not taking me. I said, well, I told you over a month ago. And the reason that she's home now because my son is coming up tonight with all of the grands. Well, that's fine. I'll be back on Saturday.
Betty Stewart Fullwood again. And the answer from the other perspective, Ms. Vivian, to the question as to what happened to all of the other kids. As a native Gainesvillian and as a product of East Side education, when I was going to school, from elementary school all the way up through high school, and going to school and getting on the bus, and I never saw any white kids. And I thought, they are some dumb kids. They're never going to school. That was just what I thought about it, because I never saw them. You know, when we got the bus to go to school and we went on school trips, I never saw them. And they were not a part of my community. They were not a part of my neighborhood. They were not a part of my educational system. So I don't know what they were asking about us, but I know that was my answer to them, that they are some dumb kids because they're never going to school.
I was just say something. Okay, then. It does go to show you, though, without education, but both sides, parents educating. We were in a workshop one time, and one lady got up and said, well, how do we get our children to know this? I said, you are their first teacher. You are their parent. Before you send them off anywhere, you're their first teacher, so you teach it. You teach it in the home, you teach it in the school.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you, Ryan. I don't really have a question as much as I have a statement. And first, I'd like to begin by thanking all of the panelists and the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program for making this possible today. My name is Desmond Walker, and I'm the coordinator at the Aquin Jones Museum and Cultural Center. And I just wanted to say that we're blessed and privileged to be able to do the work that we do. Because really what we are charged with is moving forward while looking back. I remember my experience when I had the opportunity to first take a seat at the Aquin Jones Museum. I was coming from having been gone about 25 years. This is home for me. But I had been gone for about 25 years, and when I returned back home to Gainesville, I was at somewhat of a crossroads in my life, really trying to decide how long I was going to stay. And my manager may not have thought it was in my best interest, but I told him, you know, I wasn't sure I was going to take this job. But it was truly one of the most rewarding things that I have ever done because of the very visceral response that we get every time someone walks through those doors. Whether you are a student, whether you are an adult, the fact that you get a chance to experience the history, to tell the story. Ms. Ora White just said a little bit earlier today that the human spirit is resilient, and absolutely it is. The opportunity to be able to preserve and tell those histories, share that story, and to educate is so incredibly important. For those of you who do not know, Aquin Jones was a prolific educator, and he was responsible for accrediting the second school in the entire state of Florida for African Americans. And individuals oftentimes say, wow, that was in Gainesville? Yeah, that was right here in Gainesville. So I'm going to make a shameless plug at this point. If at some point during this symposium you feel led to, we invite you to join us at the Aquin Jones Museum and Cultural Center, where we currently have our second exhibit up. It is entitled Lincoln High School, A Metaphor for Excellence. I guarantee you, if you come by, you'll understand why the Big Red was just that. Some of the history that you have heard Mr. and Mrs. White discuss, and also Ms. Vivian Filer discuss, is on display right now. You will understand the power of education for African Americans in the state of Florida by way of that exhibit. I thank you so much, and I hope to see you.
So I think that's pretty much time for this panel. I would like to say, before everyone gets up, we do also have sign-up sheets over at the registration table. If you would want to tell your story for the archives, or if you know anyone who may want to share their story for the archives, we do have sign-up sheets out there. And we will be reconvening at, oh, okay, or maybe I'll hand the mic off to Paul. But if you could please, if you could at least give a round of applause to the panelists, please.
Thank you, Ryan, and I've been asked to make just a few announcements. We do have two shuttles. One is a bus, and one is a 25-person shuttle. They both say UF Health on them. When I walked in, they were still parked in the parking lot, so those shuttles will go around to Midtown, to some of the restaurants that are right across the street, but also eventually back to North Lawn if you need to get back to the parking area. And so they will be circulating. If you're looking for them, again, ask a staff person, and they will guide you to the shuttle. So as Ryan mentioned, we will reconvene at, actually, let me make sure I was looking at Friday. It's not Friday yet, is it? It is Thursday. So we're going to reconvene at 2:30 p.m., and we're going to get a chance to hear from Evelyn Mickle, Albert White, Bernard Hicks, and we're going to see a portion of Gator Tales, which tells a very important story. And again, Mrs. Mickle, Mr. White, and Mr. Hicks are going to respond to that story. So how is everyone doing now? Excellent. All right. I think we have a very good start, momentum. Enjoy your lunch break, and we'll see you back here at 2:30 p.m. Thank you.